Thank you.
Yes.
Everything is working. I can start now. So, hi everybody, welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I want to welcome you to this panel about the power of the Jaguar. My name is Liliana Jauregui, and with my colleague Lucia Guaita, we have convened this session of today about this feline from the Americas, the Jaguar. I want to start with some logistics. The session, I want to remind you that this session is recorded. The session is going to be translated into Spanish, and to change to Spanish interpretation, click the globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen and select Spanish. Esta sesión está traducida en español. Para escuchar la sesión en español, haga clic al icono del globo que está en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom y seleccione español. This session is convened by IUCN the Netherlands. IUCN is the World Conservation Union. We work for the Dutch committee, and it's part of the Operation Jaguar. And Operation Jaguar is a project dedicated to combat and the trafficking jaguars and its parts. Jaguars have been increasingly endangered, primarily to habitat loss and human-wildlife conflicts, and recently wildlife trade. But we have learned that in order to protect the jaguar, we need to learn and to appreciate the local and indigenous views and knowledge, because indigenous territories overlap with the world's biodiversity. And in the case of the jaguar, this is very evident. So I hope this panel is going to be interesting for you, and mainly for the ones from the conservation field. We are going to learn about different disciplines and very different views, all about the jaguar. And today is the first of the two sessions about the power of the jaguar. Lucia, over to you.
Thank you, Liliana. Welcome to everyone. So I would like to just remind to the audience that if along the session you have any question, please post them in the Zoom chat. Do not post them in the VOA app. Thanks for that. And so I would like to introduce you to our discussant, who will introduce all the speakers, but also will lead the discussion later on. So he's Silvio Marchini. Silvio holds a doctorate in wildlife conservation from the University of Oxford, and he's a member of the IUCN Conservation Planning Specialist Group and the IUCN Task Force on Human-Wildlife Conflict. Silvio has also co-edited the book Human-Wildlife Interactions, Turning Conflict into Coexistence, and he has taught human dimension and planning for human-wildlife coexistence to students and wildlife professionals in many different countries, Brazil, the UK, United States, Central America, and also Malaysia. So I'll leave the floor to Silvio.
Thank you, Lucia and Liliana. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's good to be here, enjoy with you in the next hour and a half. The privilege of listening to our speakers, sharing with us some of their expertise on the relation between people and the most emblematic species in Latin America, jaguar. It is with pride that I introduce our speakers. Melissa Arias. He recently obtained a PhD in zoology from the University of Oxford. Her doctoral research focused on the illegal trade of jaguars in Latin America. Melissa currently serves as a jaguar conservation specialist for the Convention on Migratory Species and the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. In addition to jaguars, Melissa's past professional and academic engagements have included ecology and conservation of the Sumatran tiger in Indonesia, the evaluation and management of protected areas, sustainable tourism, and adaptation to climate change. Maria Fernanda Puerto Carrillo. Maria Fernanda is a Venezuelan biologist and the founder of the NGO Sebraba project. During the last 14 years, Maria Fernanda has been completely committed to protecting the jaguars of Venezuela, which are under immense pressure due to retaliatory killing and habitat loss. Her main objective is to mitigate such conflict and threats faced by jaguars in the south of Zulia State, one of the most dangerous places in the country, and more recently in a new project in the state of Amazonas with the P020a indigenous community. Cristina Gudin Violante is a conservation biologist with more than 10 years of experience in research and policy of biodiversity conservation, climate change, and sustainable development in the tropics. He's currently a PhD student at the University of Southampton. Previously, he worked for the United Nations Development Program at the Mexican Commission of Protected Areas. Felipe Susekind is a professor at the Department of Social Sciences at the Pontifical University, Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, where he develops projects in the areas of environmental studies, multi-species ethnographies, and science studies. He holds a doctorate in social anthropology from the Museu Nacional, National Museum of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and a master's degree in social history, also from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. His fieldwork experience was on cattle ranches in the Pantanal in Brazil that were home to jaguar conservation projects which resulted in the publication of the book, The Jaguar's Trail, Human-Animal Relations in the Brazilian Pantanal. And Glenn Shepard. Glenn is an ethnobotanist, medical anthropologist, and filmmaker with more than 30 years of field experience in the Amazon. He's currently a staff researcher in the Human Sciences Division at the Guild Museum in Belém, Brazil, and a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Hey, what an excellent group. So we can't wait to hear them. So without further ado, let's get started. Melissa, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Silvio. Very nice to be here. You can see my presentation. There it is. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, well, hello to everyone tuning in today. As Silvio mentioned, my name is Melissa Ayas, and today I will share with you a little bit about my PhD research, which I conducted at the Zoology Department of the University of Oxford, and as a member of the Interdisciplinary Center for Conservation Science and the Oxford Martin Program on Wildlife Trade. The title of my presentation is A Valuable Inconvenience: Complex Relationships Between People and Jaguars in Northwestern Bolivia and Their Links to the Illegal Wildlife Trade. Next slide, please. I would like to start by talking briefly about the history of jaguar trade and why I decided to work on this topic. To begin, it is important to realize that the trade in jaguars is not something recent, and in fact, it has a very long history dating back to many indigenous civilizations in pre-colonial times. Later in the 20th century, hundreds of thousands of jaguars were traded to supply the fashion industry in Europe. This large-scale trade came to an end in 1975 when the jaguar was listed in the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES. After this listing, jaguar trade became a result of opportunistic encounters between humans and jaguars, or a product of conflict due to depredation of domestic animals by jaguars. But in the last decade, new seizures of jaguar canine teeth have been made, suggesting that international jaguar trade has resurfaced. In Bolivia alone, between 2014 and 2018, around 600 jaguar teeth were seized while in transit to China. Despite a lack of information about the factors that led to these seizures and their actors, these seizures gained a lot of media and policy attention and led to the Jaguar being declared a symbol of the fight against wildlife trafficking in the region in 2019. Next slide, please. These seizures and the uncertainty around them led me to focus my PhD on this issue, with the objectives of improving scientific knowledge on the characteristics and drivers of Jaguar trafficking, and to use this information to guide decision-making to address this threat and conserve the species. Next slide, please. I decided to work in Bolivia since this was the country with the most seizures and evidence on Jaguar trafficking. It should be noted that all forms of Jaguar killing or trade in the country, with a few exceptions, are illegal. Together with my team of Bolivian researchers, we conducted a large-scale survey to learn about Jaguar trade from the perspective of rural mixed ethnicity communities that coexist with jaguars and who could become involved in the supply of Jaguar body parts. Within Bolivia, we worked within these 4 green circles around urban centers, which are located in the lowlands of the northwest of the country. Inside these circles, we randomly selected small rural villages and individual households based on satellite photos. In total, we covered 36 communities and over 1,000 people, and we traveled more or less 10% of the country's territory. Next slide, please. The survey, I'm being asked to speak slower, sorry. The survey, which was anonymous and reviewed by an ethical review board, began with some socioeconomic questions such as people's age, education, income, and profession. We then asked about perceptions and attitudes towards jaguars and about experiences with the species, including attacks on people and depredation on domestic animals. We then asked about each person's involvement in jaguar trafficking, including owning, buying, or selling jaguar body parts, hunting jaguars, or whether people had been recruited to kill jaguars. As these behaviors are illegal and these questions can be sensitive to answer, we gave participants the option of answering these questions secretly through the ballot box method, where they had to mark a ballot with yes or no after each question and then insert it in a closed and anonymous box. The rest of the survey also had questions about the uses of jaguar parts, hunting methods, and the actors involved in the trade. Next slide, please. Now moving on to the results. We found that people's involvement in jaguar hunting and trafficking in these areas we visited was very, very high, since 42 or nearly half of my respondents had owned jaguar body parts in the past 5 years. Likewise, 24% have been recruited to hunt jaguars, 19% have hunted jaguars, 16% have recruited others to hunt, and 15 and 13% have sold or bought jaguar body parts, respectively. Since my sample was random and represented only a small proportion of the population living in these areas, it was quite evident that the number of people who participate in jaguar trafficking is very high. Next slide, please. The surveys not only allowed us to get an idea of the scale of these behaviors, but also to develop a more detailed typology of the actors. For example, a large part of the respondents carried out non-commercial actions only. Many had possessed jaguar body parts for personal use that had been gifted to them without ever having personally purchased or killed jaguars, even though this type of possession is also illegal. Others were jaguar hunters who either did or did not extract jaguar body parts for personal use only. There were also indirect hunters who asked others to kill jaguars for non-commercial reasons, such as retaliation for livestock depredation. There were also profiles of commercial actors, such as killing traders who hunted jaguars and also bought and sold their parts. Others were just consumers or just traders. There was also a group of messengers who were recruited to hunt but never actually did it, or who simply spread the word. Next slide, please. We also learned from the surveys that one of the main drivers of jaguar trafficking in these areas were a wide range of functional, decorative, medicinal, and cultural domestic uses. All kinds of accessories can be made from jaguar skins, such as wallets, purses, hats, belts, you name it. It is also common to find the skins being used as decorative tapestries hung on walls of houses or transformed into furniture. The faces, teeth, and skulls were also used in a more spiritual context to make costumes or as amulets that attract good luck. Jaguar fat was one of the most common products, and it was used as a syrup to treat respiratory problems and also as an ointment to treat joint and bone diseases. Next slide, please. Another important driver were the negative perceptions and attitudes towards jaguars in these areas. 75% of my respondents had negative perceptions of jaguars, and they use words like fear, dangerous, or bad to refer to the species. It is worth highlighting that although fewer, some people also had neutral or even positive perceptions of jaguars, admiring their strength or beauty, or referring to them as an adornment of the forest. Nevertheless, over half of my participants believe that killing jaguars is a good thing. Related to these perceptions was the conflict between humans and jaguars, which emerged as another important driver. Although it is generally said that jaguars do not attack people, 3% of my respondents described aggressive encounters with jaguars that put their own lives at risk, and 25% had also suffered losses from predation on livestock or other domestic animals such as dogs. Next slide, please. This image represents one of the typical stories of conflict with the jaguar that I heard during my interviews. This one was about a mother who had frequent problems with jaguars coming very close to her house and attacking her domestic animals. Beyond the economic losses, she was afraid of jaguars because she had small children who were at risk of being attacked. To defend her animals and family, she learned how to shoot approaching jaguars from the window of her own house, and she sold the resulting jaguar body parts to markets in northern towns. I like to tell this story because I think it illustrates a different phase of jaguar traffickers who are not always the violent and evil organized criminals that we imagine them to be. Next slide, please. Another strong driver of the jaguar trade were market incentives. 67% of my respondents knew where and to whom they could sell jaguar body parts. When I asked them about these buyers, 43% mentioned that they were national traders from the same communities or from more distant areas in Bolivia. 20% also knew of the presence of traffickers of Asian descent, and 3% had been recruited directly by these buyers, although they described them as mainly people from the Asian diaspora in Latin America who had lived in Bolivia for a long time. And this point is very important because many Asian countries, including China, do not allow a dual nationality, which means that these traders are also national traders. My interviewees also spoke of European or North American buyers who came to visit the villages as tourists or missionaries or volunteers, and also traders from neighboring countries. 3% had learned about the jaguar market through radio announcements requesting body parts, and 27% also knew the current prices of jaguar body parts. And finally, another important driver were the low costs and penalties associated with wildlife trafficking in the country. The vast majority of my respondents did not know that there were laws, penalties, or even authorities in charge of protecting jaguars and other wildlife. Next slide, please. As final reflections, perhaps the most important result of my research is that a large part of the jaguar trade in Bolivia is domestic, opportunistic, and related to the traditional practices and conflict with the species. This discovery is important because it means that if the response to trafficking focuses solely on the international component of the trade or treats it exclusively as an organized crime, trafficking to supply the domestic market will continue to exist, and rural communities may be approached in a way that is not conducive to human jaguar coexistence. Although there is also a component of international trade in jaguar body parts, more research on this is needed. Another important point is that the actors involved in jaguar trafficking are diverse, and so are its drivers. And this means that multifaceted and interdisciplinary interventions must be carried out, including law enforcement, but crucially, by understanding the perspectives of those involved in the trade and their complex relationships with jaguars. Next slide, please. Before closing, I just wanted to thank several individuals and institutions that made this research possible. And in the next slide. And thanks to everyone watching today for your attention and for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Melissa is the first to present on this panel because her talk makes an excellent introduction to two important and growing threats to jaguars that explicitly involve human element. They involve people, illegal wildlife trade and human wildlife conflict. Her talk can also be seen as part of a framework that we can use to connect talks and structure the discussion in this panel. The framework I have in mind is composed of two axes, two continuums. One of these axes is about the research approach, which ranges from quantitative, explicitly conservation or solution-oriented, and aiming to generate numbers that can guide conservation decisions and evaluate the success conservation actions. To the other end of this continuum, to research whose objective is to obtain an in-depth understanding of the relations between people and jaguars. I call this axis conservation to anthropology axis. It has to do with disciplines. The other axis connects research to application. It goes from what we do to generate knowledge to what we do to cause change. And such a change implies involving actors beyond academia, decision makers and local residents. I call this axis research to application axis. This is the axis of transdisciplinary collaboration. The research presented by Melissa aimed to generate quantitative information that is directly relevant to conservation of the jaguar, which she did by interviewing over 1,100 people. Now, let's now shift along the research to application axis, learn more about Maria Fernanda's work on community engagement. I think we have a recording of her presentation. That's what we're going to watch now. Video, please.
Hola, mi nombre es María Fernanda Puerto, fundadora y coordinadora del proyecto Cebrava. Hoy vengo a hablarles sobre nuestra experiencia en nuestro trabajo de proyecto de investigación y conservación del jaguar aquí en Venezuela, que iniciamos desde el 2007 en una región ubicada al oeste del país, que es el sur del lago de Maracaibo, en el estado Zulia, donde nuestra experiencia, que es lo que vengo a contarles el día de hoy, nuestra experiencia con las comunidades locales ha sido un poco distinta a cómo ha sido nuestra experiencia reciente con las comunidades indígenas del Amazonas, que es otra zona donde hemos iniciado un nuevo proyecto este año. Desde el 2007, cuando iniciamos nuestro trabajo de investigación en Surlago, una de las cosas que conocimos, ya que era una de las regiones menos estudiadas del país, es más, era el primer proyecto de investigación del jaguar que se realizaba en esa zona del país. Una de las cosas que vimos era el tema de la cacería por represalias que se estaba generando desde hace décadas dirigidas hacia el jaguar y el puma en esta zona. Una de las cosas que vimos es que había una cacería a estos felinos, sin embargo, no había conocimiento en estas comunidades sobre la prohibición o la parte legal que hay de la cacería de uno de estos felinos que están en Venezuela. Está catalogado, por lo menos el jaguar, como una especie vulnerable a la extinción. En este caso, una de las cosas que quisimos hacer para conocer o quizás llegar a más personas de la comunidad local fue incorporar a nuestro proyecto personas de la comunidad, no solamente personas que quisieran el jaguar, sino que también incluyéramos otras personas que también habían tenido este conflicto, predación de animales de cría o por algún otro evento y que daban muerte a estos animales, como los cazadores, por supuesto, o pescadores que eran los que tenían en su momento mayores encuentros con los jaguares y de alguna manera, por el encuentro justificado con temor, se hacía se ejecutaba al animal, ¿no? Entonces, una de las cosas que nosotros vimos y quisimos probar o quisimos incorporar, trabajar de la mano con estas personas, involucrarlos al proyecto, no solamente involucrarlos a través de charlas educativas y toda esta parte informativa que fue clave también para nuestro proyecto, sino también que se involucraran en la participación completa del proyecto, desde la instalación de cámaras trampas, que era parte de nuestro objetivo, desde la ubicación de zonas de descanso de estos animales, o sea, conocer todas las rutas o toda la ecología y el comportamiento de estos animales en la zona a través de los ojos de los cazadores, pero involucrarlos en todo este proceso y que durante este proceso hubiese un trabajo también de educación a la par mientras ellos estaban trabajando con nosotros. Y digamos que nuestra sorpresa fue que no solamente vimos el cambio de los jugadores que estaban trabajando directamente dentro del proyecto, sino que ellos se convirtieron en una fuente de información o de difusión sobre la conservación o de la importancia de estos felinos en la región. Entonces, actualmente estos famosos cazadores que menciono muchas veces, inclusive resalto el nombre de Rolando Méndez, que es uno de las principales personas que nos ha apoyado desde el 2007, el cambio que hubo en esta persona y digamos que la transformación que hubo a nivel de información fue mucho más grande, ya que ellos se convirtieron en las personas que difundían el mensaje de protección del felino. En este sentido, obviamente queríamos replicar esto en distintas zonas. En 2016 decidimos ampliar nuestro trabajo de investigación, decidimos incluir no solamente los parcelamientos de donde se ejecutaba la agricultura de siembra de plátano, ¿verdad? Sino que también quisimos involucrar áreas protegidas, que eran digamos que lo que servía como refugio realmente de bosque protegido para el jaguar. Involucramos las aledañas al Parque Nacional Ciénagas Juan Manuel y también la Reserva de Fauna Silvestre Ciénagas Juan Manuel de Aguas Blancas y Aguas Negras, que se encuentran en esta zona del sur del lago de Maracaibo. Y en este momento no solamente hablábamos con cazadores, sino que también tratamos de incorporar pescadores que residían en esta zona, más al norte donde habíamos trabajado inicialmente desde el 2007. Y nuestra sorpresa también es que hubo el mismo efecto, involucrarlos dentro del proyecto, involucrarnos en la instalación, no solamente llegar a su casa y preguntar dónde estaba el animal, sino que llevarlo junto a nosotros, todo el equipo, durante todo el proceso, durante todos esos años, habíamos logrado un cambio importante en pescadores y en cazadores, que realmente todos los entrevistados habían dado muerte a algún felino, principalmente a algún jaguar. Entonces, digamos que esta parte de involucrarnos cambiaba un poco la visión que se tenía sobre el temor también de este animal, el conocer realmente, digamos, constantemente cuál era el comportamiento de estos animales, hacía que también ellos entendieran por qué estaban ocurriendo, por ejemplo, los ataques de depredación sobre esos animales y todo eso. Y digamos que todo el cambio, todo ese proceso de información del jaguar malo o dañino se estaba modificando y se nos acercaban inclusive cazadores que hablaban o ellos mismos buscaban de conectarse con nosotros para saber si era verdad que se pudiese hacer un turismo dirigido al jaguar. O sea que ya estaba llegando el mensaje, inclusive actualmente se maneja un mensaje donde la gente de las comunidades, de algunas comunidades, quieran hacer inclusive turismo dirigido al jaguar porque ya la visión ha cambiado. Esto ocurrió con las comunidades locales, que no son comunidades indígenas, de la región del sur del lago de Maracaibo, y vimos inclusive una reacción positiva hasta de los mismos ganaderos de grandes extensiones de tierra o de grandes propiedades, nos han buscado durante algunos años para tratar este problema de la depredación y así poder evitar el conflicto entre el jaguar y el ganado o el ganadero y así poder mitigar esta problemática de la cacería. Entonces, digamos que la transformación, el involucrar a los cazadores y a los pescadores que habían dado muerte de alguna manera a estos felinos, era un impacto, generó un impacto mucho mayor en el mensaje que se llevaba a la comunidad, porque era la misma comunidad mostrando a la comunidad que se podía convivir con el jaguar. Entonces, bueno, queríamos replicar, digamos, algo de esta experiencia en otra zona que iniciamos este año, en un trabajo de investigación, que es en el estado Amazonas, ya hacia el sur del país, en lo que es la parte de nuestra Amazonía venezolana. Y claro, aquí ya es una experiencia distinta, ya hay una experiencia, ya digamos que más interna, íntima, porque ya estamos hablando con las comunidades indígenas. En esta otra región, indígenas con las que estamos trabajando son las comunidades Piaroa, ¿verdad? Y digamos que la relación entre la comunidad indígena con el medio ambiente, incluyendo el jaguar, es sumamente distinto. Inclusive el jaguar es visto de distintas maneras, aunque se ha cambiado, se ha modificado un poco la percepción del jaguar debido a la evangelización que ha ocurrido por décadas. Pero digamos que se mantiene ese mensaje de el jaguar es un vehículo de transición para los chamanes transitar a través del bosque. El jaguar es la fuente que usa el chamán para revisar qué hay en otras comunidades. O sea, ya la relación que existe con el jaguar ha sido un poco distinta a las comunidades locales de la otra región que les mencioné. Interesante aquí de entender esto, ¿sí? De cómo se puede trabajar en estos programas de investigación y de conservación en zonas tan distintas, es que digamos que hay que entender como que la visión de cada zona para poder dar con la forma más precisa para conectar a estas personas con la importancia del jaguar. En este caso, por ejemplo, vimos que una de las cosas que ellos temían sobre el jaguar era por desconocimiento. Por ejemplo, muchos de ellos pensaban que de las comunidades indígenas pensaban que el jaguar podía vivir 60, 70 o 80 años y que esos jaguares que ellos habían intentado cazar hace 60 años, esos abuelos, podían recordar a estos cazadores y podían atacarlos. Entonces, cuando les comentábamos un poco sobre la ecología en estas charlas educativas, cuando los llevábamos a instalar cámaras trampas también, porque usamos el mismo sistema, nos dimos cuenta que ellos inclusive nos respondían sobre el desconocimiento que entonces había en su comunidad sobre la especie y el cambio que podía haber siempre y cuando ocurriera esta educación, o sea, llegar a esta información a la comunidad. Entonces nos dimos cuenta que de alguna manera siempre, bien sea comunidades locales o bien sea comunidades indígenas, hay una percepción muy distinta cuando se incorpora la información o la educación, ¿no? Sobre la especie. Y ellos ven todo el proceso, creo que es una forma más rápida de obtener un cambio y ellos mismos se convierten en replicadores y nos pasó en un corto periodo de tiempo estando en el mismo viaje a Amazonas, ya se había llegado el mensaje a otras comunidades y otras comunidades nos pidieron trabajar en sus tierras. En Sur del Lago, digamos que nos tardamos años en que ocurriera este proceso, pero acá hemos visto un cambio más rápido. Entonces creo que eso, el incorporar a las comunidades dentro del proyecto, no que sean aliados, sino que sean parte del equipo de trabajo, que se vean incorporados en todo el proceso desde el día 1, creo que es fundamental para cambiar la mentalidad o la visión que se tiene del jaguar en estas comunidades, bien sea local o bien sea indígena. Creo que es fundamental para que haya un mayor impacto o resultados más positivos, porque ellos son los replicadores de nuestros mensajes de conciencia.
Nice video, Maria Fernanda. Thank you. Your talk, following Melissa's talk, illustrates a trend in wildlife management conservation. The field was initially about working on wildlife, doing ecological research. In the last 3 or 4 decades, decision-making in wildlife management conservation has expanded its basis to also include information about the stakeholders. Human dimensions became a mandatory part of the process. Work on wildlife was not enough. It was necessary to work on people as well, doing social research. And I think it's safe to say that we are now in a third stage of this trend, of this expanding process, where in addition to working on wildlife and on people, the conservation scientist works with people, producing knowledge together, making decisions together, bringing about changes together. And it is hoped that the changes thus produced will be more sustainable and fair. Maria Fernanda's work is an example of this approach. It has positively changed the attitudes and behaviors of hunters towards jaguars, people who used to kill jaguars before. Now, moving perhaps slightly further along the research to application axis, let's listen to Christina, whose talk addresses changes that go beyond the specific attitudes and behaviors. She talks about transformation. It's over to you, Christina.
Thank you very much, Silvio. Hello, everyone. Thank you for letting me share with you my PhD project. It's my PhD research project is called Transformative Change in the Calakmul Biosphere Reserve, the honeybee and the jaguar as means and measure for sustainable livelihoods. The next slide, please, and we'll move directly to the next. Thank you. Okay, so I will start today by saying that ecosystems and their associated biodiversity are declining globally, and this is endangering the very foundations for quality of life and security in food, water, and energy needs. And although this is a global problem, the world's poorest regions are those that are experiencing the worst impact from global changes in biodiversity, in climate, and in their associated ecosystem services provision. So today I will use the jaguar as an example on this link between nature and people. And I will try to highlight how preserving jaguars might contribute to preserve the well-being of many rural communities in one of the poorest regions in Mexico. The next slide, please. So, well, jaguars are a very valuable species in Mexico. They're very well known among society, and they have this very special value for all of us. This has been since pre-Hispanic cultures, as you can see here in my slide in the codes and pictures that I present, and it is still happening today for indigenous communities, but also for more Western or urban settings, as you can see here. The jaguar is represented in our highest or most expensive bill, and also many the football teams are represented by the jaguars. So it is very common in society. However, this value, this symbolic value, does not translate in conservation or doesn't make better the conservation status of jaguars throughout the country. And today I'm going to describe what is happening in the Calakmul Biosphere Reserve. This is the largest protected area containing tropical forest in Mexico, And it is also a very important site internationally because it is the largest rainforest in all the American continent after the Amazon. It connects the whole Maya forest with Guatemala and Belize. So it is a very important site in terms of biodiversity. The next presentation, please. I'm sorry, here is a Calakmul Biosphere Reserve. You can see, sorry, I'm a bit, I'm not synchronized with my slide. Here, as you can see in my slide, there's a Calakmul Biosphere Reserve in southern Mexico, next to Guatemala and Belize. The next one, please. And well, this area is also very important for jaguar populations. It has the biggest population in the whole country. I'm showing you preliminary results of our own study that show that although we have a large population, these are declining in the area. The next slide, please. And apart from the biodiversity or the biological importance the area has, it is also a very important archaeological, it is also a very important site in terms of archaeology. Here we have remnants of the Mayan civilization, and today it is home of more than 52 rural and indigenous communities. Ironically, none of these communities is native to the area. All these communities have come from all around Mexico, and they have been displaced from their original sites, and they were relocated in this area. The next slide, please. Well, this is important because in terms of culture, traditions, and practices, we have a very big mixture that translates in a single physical space. And the Calakmul area is beautiful, but it has naturally harsh conditions. For those of you who have the chance to visit, you will know that it is a green desert. It is completely dry, despite being a tropical forest, because there are no permanent water bodies. There are just temporary ponds that form during the rainy season, and these ponds are called aguadas, and they are the only source of water for both people and wildlife. And well, I just have to mention that the 52 rural communities that live in this area live in very deprived conditions, and they really depend on the forest resources for their livelihoods. And well, the problem is that lately, subsistence arable farming had provided the primary source of income of the rural communities living here. But for the last 10 years, as a result of climate change, there have been increasing droughts that have produced crop failures. So these communities are forced to rely on government subsidies that promote cattle ranching. So I know that this sounds weird, but in a place that is already dry, they're bringing cows, you know, like to live here. And well, the subsequent conversion of forest to pasture further exacerbates regional precipitation extremes and also depletes the wild game in the forest that supplement the diet of the communities that live here. The next slide, please. And well, a part of the impacts that I already mentioned, this brings a lot of problems in terms of the human-affiliate conflict. As you all know, as in many other regions of all the American continent, the more cows, more problem with jaguars and with other fillets. This is happening in Calakmul. And well, there is also another kind of problem in terms of the human-fillet conflict, because this lack of water is making some ungulate species migrate down south. And there is a bigger competition for prey between humans and jaguars. So, well, this requires, or this makes the need of effective strategies that generate a transformative change to benefit people and nature in the region. And there have been many attempts of reducing the human-fillet conflict here. There are compensation schemes. There have been electric fences, programs to put electric fences, and you know, many of these kind of projects that are helpful but don't cure, you know, the illness. They just mitigate the symptoms but don't go through the core of the problem. So the next slide, please. So this is not, there are not only bad or negative situations here. There's also a few individuals in the reserve that are finding economic security through other means. They're using honey production, putting apiaries within the forest, and they see benefits from forest biodiversity, because the more biodiversity, the better quality of their honey. And this activity is better if there are more producers in the region. So, well, based on this, we have a vision for this project of resilient communities living in healthy forests. So we are trying to work toward different objectives and aims, both in the short term and in the long term. And of this, we want to evaluate the sustainability of the current livelihoods, specifically cattle ranching, honey production, and hunting, which is a very common practice in the region. And we want to evaluate and understand how these farming communities perceive well-being, and what are the pathways that they envisage for achieving economic and food security. And at the same time, we want to assess the ecosystem health in the Calakmul region using jaguars as indicators of ecosystem health. And having all this panorama will help us find ways to reduce the human-jaguar conflict. The next slide, please. And to do this, we are using two different approaches. We have anthropology and we have ecology, to have a broader view and therefore better solutions in the area. So we are working with the rural communities that live here. We are working in 3 communities as a starting point. The next slide, please. And we were trying to build or co-produce with the communities a cost-benefit analysis of both cattle farming and honey production. And we realized that beekeeping is much more resilient than cattle ranching. If I tell this to you, this might sound obvious. I don't need to explain to all the people here in the audience why one is better than the others in terms of ecology and income. But for the people in Calakmul, we needed a different approach to make this obvious, or to understand this kind of issues here. The next slide, please. So we were working with them, doing interviews, focus groups, different workshops, and all this work derived in people being interested in honey production. And we were able to develop capacity building workshops and training for apiculture that were not given by me or by any other people outside the area. These were led by local honey producers living in neighbor communities, with the aim of sharing the knowledge, but also building the strength of the honey production network in Calakmul. The next slide, please. Here I'm just sharing some pictures of the kind of workshops we were doing. And I think a very important point to highlight is that we got a lot of participation and initiative of women who were willing to attend the workshops. And this is important in this context because women are not an active part of the economies of these communities. As in all of Mexico, we have very macho, men-dominated way of living. So this was a very big step in this area. The next slide, please. So we are hoping that we can mitigate the effects of cattle ranching and change this activity with honey production enterprises that will avoid deforestation and further conflicts with the jaguars. And well, at the same time, we are understanding or trying to understand how the hunting practices are developed in the Calakmul region. I won't go into detail in this because we had a presentation in other panel specifically on hunting. But hunting is a very important practice in Calakmul for self-subsistence. People depend on the protein intake of wild animals, and they compete with jaguars to get the prey. Here, the focus is not as much in jaguars, it's more in the ungulate species that live here. So we are trying to understand why they hunt, what motivates the hunting, if they are selling the meat internally, what is happening, because there is no information on this, at least in this region. So we are exploring this this issue here. The next slide, please. But how can we ground truth all this information? How do we translate this into the ecology, into the conservation status of the forest, the jaguars and the mammal communities? And to do this, we are monitoring the ecosystem health of the Calakmul forest. The next slide, please. And for this, we are using camera traps and acoustic devices. And with the camera traps, we are trying to assess the jaguar and the prey populations, the state of the populations of the jaguars and their prey. And the acoustic devices help us to monitor the hunting pressures. So we can, I don't know how to say it, sorry. We can monitor the shotguns, the hunting frequency. And with this, along with other indicators, we can have a picture of how the ecosystem is doing in the region. The next slide, please. Sorry, there's my camera. Okay, and the next slide. And here I'm just sharing with you some pictures that we have gotten so far. Here, as you can see, jaguars are also affected by this drought that I talked about. They rely on these artificial water drinking containers that are set by the managers of the Calakmul Biosphere Reserve as an adaptation strategy to all these droughts that have been occurring in the region. The next slide, please. And well, just to have a broader idea of the viability of the populations, we are doing DNA analysis of the populations in the reserve. And the next slide. And well, just to close my presentation with some final thoughts. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened to my video. Okay, just to close, we can still achieve sustainable futures. We rely on more sustainable activities, livelihoods, practices, sorry, globally, but starting from local, acting locally, thinking globally. But this requires changes in all levels of society. And just to give you a very quick example, people in Calakmul don't keep cows to eat themselves. They keep cows because there is a demand of beef all around the area. So maybe we can discuss on this later, but we all really need to change our perspectives and our ways of living to achieve a more sustainable society. Also, scientists and practitioners, we need to support communities based on their needs and on their preferences. As Maria Fernanda said, including them from the beginning, not just going to a place and imposing solutions. And well, there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. Honey production works in Calakmul because Mexico is the third biggest exporter of honey worldwide. And because Campeche, the state with Calakmul is the one that supplies more of that honey. So the more producers there are, the better for the business, the better for the communities. And there is a very good supply chain and value chain in these activities, not just because this is an easy conservation strategy. It works in Calakmul, it might not work in other areas, and we have to consider that. And well, just to close, jaguars pose a great value for the rural communities, but also for researchers and conservation practitioners in different ways. The next slide. Thank you very much for listening, and here are our contact details in case you have any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. You take a more systemic approach in which concepts such as resilience and healthy ecosystems are highlighted, and in which the benefit to people takes a more central place when the ultimate goal is to improve livelihoods and well-being. And the jaguar is used as an indicator of ecosystem health. And that brings us to an important issue, which many conservationists take for granted, the question of values. Melissa, Maria Fernanda, and Christina together describe situations where the jaguar is bad, the situations where the jaguar is good, for different stakeholders, for different people. For the conservationist, however, jaguars are always good. They must always be protected. As a matter of fact, these approaches involve a concern with local knowledge and practices in which different stakeholders' opinions and interests are being addressed, inform scientific and managerial practices and procedures. However, this still takes place within a discourse of conservation that is essentially global. We can say that conservation and human-wildlife conflict and the science behind them are recent Western inventions. And this can carry on problematic colonial legacies that have been pointed out by anthropologists. So now moving along the conservation science to anthropology, towards anthropology along this axis, our next speaker, Felipe, will be telling us about what he found when he looked at the contrasts, the interactions between scientific, Western scientific and local knowledge in the Brazilian Pantanal. Felipe, please. I can hear you, Felipe. Is your mic open? Felipe? Is it?
Can I go now?
Yes, please.
I would like to present to you today some material from a field research carried out some years ago, an attempt at something like an ethnography of jaguar conservation. In 2008, as a student, I made 2 fieldwork trips to the south of the Brazilian Pantanal. Next slide, please. One during the wet season and one during the dry season. You can see here. Next one, please. The farm where I stayed was located on the edge of the Miranda River between the cities of Miranda and Corumbá. At the end of the dry season, I witnessed an event that would later organize the writing of my thesis. Here, next one, is a photograph taken by a camera trap on the 3rd of November of 2008. It appears on the report made by the team of the Projeto Onça Pantaneira, Pantanal Jaguar Project, coordinated by biologist Fernando Azevedo from the Pro-Carnivore Association. This photograph connected somehow the different actors or elements I was interested in. Every element of the image could be treated as an index of a particular network that could be traced and described. The first element I want to highlight is the calf. The farm had 10,000 hectares. The last one. Can come back one slide. Thank you. The farm had the next one. The farm had 10,000 hectares and about 5,000 heads of cattle. It was a 2-month-old calf of white cattle, zebu, that would be sold 2 years later to a slaughterhouse at the nearest town, Corumbá. To take care of the herds, there were 6 herdmen. Next one, please. Campeiros, including the older 4 men and 5 cowboys. Pantanal is occupied by large-scale cattle farming and has a very unequal social and economical system. The cow industry workers usually spend on one hand what they earn on the other, to quote Lévi-Strauss when he visited the French farm in Pantanal at mid-1930s. The reality of the farms is not so different nowadays from what it was at that time. It was one of the cowboys that found the calf killed by the jaguar that morning, and the 4 men contacted the researchers by radio to give them the location. For the project, the event with the calf was a case of predation on domestic livestock. Cattle are part of jaguar diets and cohabit at Pantanal with many wild animals. Please note that the total biomass of cattle there is estimated to be 10 times bigger than the biomass of all the other animals that are part of jaguar diets. This brings us to a second element of our image, the color. There was an important technological innovation happening there. The researchers had worked with radio collars before, but the ones they were beginning to use at 2008 used GPS technology within the collars. This technical shift generated new knowledge about diets, habits, use of space, and interaction between jaguars. But let's go back to the photograph. Please pay attention to a little detail. Next one, this red string here tying the calf's legs to the surrounding vegetation. The person who tied this string was Seu João, the field guide of the project. He intended to slow the jaguar a little bit so the chance of a good photograph would be greater. Seu João used to hunt jaguars until some 30 years ago. He took care of cattle and also had his hunting dogs, so local farmers searched for him to kill jaguars in their areas. But when the farm where he used to work began to deal with ecotourism, Seu João stopped killing jaguars and gave away his dogs. After that, that same farm became home to a research project on jaguars. He was hired as a field guide and was working with conservation since then. He had a very important job monitoring the jaguars, but also visiting neighboring farmers and cowboys and talking with them about the research. At the time I met him, the project team was facing a problem. Seu João was an experienced hunter, but he didn't have good dogs in order to capture the jaguars. In face of this difficult situation, they were forced to hire a second hunter, Antônio, known as Tonho da Onça. Tonho came to the area with his pack of dogs and did the job. With him, they captured 10 jaguars in the 2-month effort. There was this children's book about his life, the story of a hunter who was known to have killed more than 600 jaguars before regenerating himself and becoming a jaguar protector. But it was only part of the story. In 2011, this disturbing news appeared in Brazilian media. A video record was shown on national television. Illegal hunting was taking place in Pantanal, with routes for tourists willing to pay around $30,000 to kill a jaguar in Brazil. The video showed a jaguar hunt. A man dressed as a safari hunter shoots a jaguar that was up in a tree. Tonho da Onça is at his side. At that time, there was a big operation from federal police. Dogs and guns were sequestrated. Tonho was not found, but his son, also a hunter, had been arrested. Hunt is illegal across the whole country since 1967, but the deep history of this kind of hunt in Pantanal can be traced back to a series of literary sources since Roosevelt's expedition to Brazil in the beginning of the 20th century. The most famous hunter since then was Sacha Simmel, a safari guide from East Europe who published adventure books in the 1950s and portrayed himself as the first white man to learn how to hunt jaguars with the zagaia, an indigenous spear, a local portrait of colonialism. But the most important to this kind of hunts are the dogs. The typical jaguar dog is known at Pantanal as Americano, American. Seu João said to me once that if you see a dog like that on a farm, it's a sure sign that there is someone hunting jaguars there. The dog alone is no match for a jaguar. In fact, they can be eventually killed. But the jaguar tends to climb a tree when chased by the pack. There he becomes an easy target for the human hunter. A master dog is known to track only jaguars and no other animal. In the past, people say that those dogs were very appreciated and were worth a lot of money. Hunting is something that jaguar conservation must deal with in places like Pantanal, where law depends on the goodwill of the farmers. But the dogs were also a key factor for jaguar conservation. In fact, hunting with dogs had been the most effective method of capturing jaguars for many years, since the beginning of jaguar studies at Pantanal. It is an example of how hunting techniques can be applied to conservation. At the same time, the case of Tonho shows the risks involved in the process. But let's return to our photograph one last time. That jaguar was a male named Mirão, who was identified through his unique spotting pattern by Henrique, the project's field biologist. Despite all efforts of Henrique and Seu João in the following days, however, it was not possible to locate the radial signal of the collar. It wasn't working as it should. I wrote to the biologist a few months after returning home, and he told me that those photographs I was looking at were the last records of Mirão. Possibilities considered for his disappearance included malfunction of the collar, having been shot dead on another farm, or even moving to a more remote and inaccessible location. Now, 12 years after those events, the situation didn't improve. Hunting is still a big problem, but Pantanal is also facing huge fires every dry season in the last years. Climate change and deforestation add to the ongoing sabotage of the environmental protection system by the actual Brazilian government, all of which casts a terrifying shadow on Jaguar's future, as well as ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Your work in anthropology reveals the outstanding cultural function of jaguars. Actually, it's not only jaguar conservation that benefits from anthropology, but also anthropology, which in turn benefits from the study of these intense, diverse, and complex relationships people always had with the jaguar throughout Latin America. Our next and last talk is about a specific and fascinating anthropological phenomenon involving jaguars. Glenn, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Lucia and Liliani also for organizing this wonderful series of events, and Sylvia for your very insightful comments. So my paper is called Growing Fur, and I'm going to be talking about the phenomenon of jaguar transformation among the Machigenga people in the Peruvian Amazon. Next slide. The jaguar is, of course, the largest predator in Middle and South America, and as was mentioned before, it is a key item in iconography from pre-Columbian times, and of course through the present. Jaguars are very important in indigenous mythologies. The first 8 myths in Levi-Strauss's famous Mythologiques involve Jaguar, myths about Jaguar and the origins of technology. And Jaguars are also very important in South American shamanism, this idea that shamans that turn into Jaguars. Next slide. I'm going to be looking at the Jaguars among the Machiginga people in southern Peru. I've worked there for 35 years, doing a number of different kinds of studies, ethnobotany, studying hunting among the Machiginga, landscape classification, and I've also made several films in the region. I never set out to study jaguars. All the other researchers actually studied jaguars, or they were specifically out to study jaguars. I just over the course of working with the Machiginga on ethnobotany, hunting studies, I've come across jaguar tracks, overheard conversations, seen people kill jaguars, seen people attacked by jaguars and nearly killed by jaguars. And out of these sort of non-intentional coincidences, I've pieced together an understanding of how the Machiginga understand jaguars. Next slide. So the Machiginga, they talk about jaguars with this word kobengari. Kobengari is a word that means it's a respect born out of fear. And so the word kobengari is used to refer to the Peruvian government, to soldiers, to psychoactive plants like ayahuasca that are powerful but also scary, and jaguars. Jaguars and other predators and dangerous animals are considered kobengari, which again, I think the best translation in English would be awful, awesome, or awe-inspiring, or awful, sort of the same idea. The idea that it's a respect born out of fear. Next slide. Yeah, and so it's even in the Machiginga dictionary, it's actually mentioned that Betty Snell wrote a Machiginga dictionary. Algo o alguien que inspira reverencia o miedo. Something or someone that inspires reverence or fear. And as an example, it says a jaguar or a government authority. Next slide, please. So the jaguar is important in Machiginga art and crafts. On the left, we see a hand-woven cotton tunic owned by Mariano, one of the great shamans who unfortunately passed away several years ago. Anyway, he's a shaman, and during an ayahuasca vision, the ayahuasca spirit came to him and said, paint a kushma with these designs, which are like the designs of jaguar, and it will protect you from illness. On the right hand, this young woman had just gotten married, and she had painted her breasts and her face with these black dots of jenipa dye. And I asked her, why are you doing that? She says, they're jaguar spots. It makes me look beautiful for my new husband. Next slide. And Machiginga mothers will paint their children with red dots of anato or achiote dye, urucum in Brazilian. And the idea again is the same thing. If in this case, this is from a film that I worked on with the Discovery Channel, Spirit Hunters. And someone had recently died in the village. And so the idea was by painting the child's face with these red spots, if the dead spirit, the dead person came and saw the child, they wouldn't see a child, they would see a jaguar and they would run away. Or same thing, if an illness spirit or an animal spirit wants to attack the child and cause an illness, they won't see a child, they'll see a ferocious jaguar and run away. Next slide. Among the Machiginga, I've documented lots of medicinal plants, and among the medicinal plants, about 25% of Machiginga medicinal plants are hunting medicines. Kobinsari means to have good aim, but it also means to be able to encounter animals in the first place. And the hunting medicines, there's a wide range of hunting medicines, dozens of species. They tend to be toxic, caustic, emetic, purgative, and psychoactive plants. And the idea is that by putting these plants in the eye or by purging the body or taking these psychoactive plants, you expel physical and spiritual impurities at the same time as you establish spiritual contact with the spirits that control hunting. And one of the main hunting spirits is the harpy eagle. And the Machiginga say that the harpy eagle brought these hunting medicines to the Machiginga in ancient times. The harpy being considered the exemplary predator with good eyesight for hunting. Next slide. Now, one of the most important hunting medicines among the Machiginga is a group of plants called sankenke. It corresponds exactly with the scientific genus of Brunfelsia. Brunfelsia is a solanaceous psychoactive plant related to Datura, Toe floripondio, Atropa belladonna in the old world. The Solanaceae are known to contain powerful psychoactive properties that cause hallucinations, visions, and so on. the Machinginga recognize a number of species of sankenke. They all have in common, they have a unique sort of intoxication that they cause visions, they can cause vomiting, they can cause convulsions, but they cause this sort of shivering sensation and a prickly sensation in your fingers and toes that's considered like a cold sensation. In Quechua, in Peruvian Quechua Spanish, they call it chirisanango, which means cold medicine. Now, the first four species, sankenke, paquitsapari, which means harpy eagle root, oshetopari, which means spider monkey root, and shimakwa, which means fish root, they're all good hunting medicines, positive hunting medicines. They were brought by the harpy eagle to make people good hunters. The last species, Kawiniri, is also a Brunfelsia, but I've never collected it because it's considered to be too dangerous. The Machinginga say that this plant, when you take it, it makes you such a good hunter that you turn into a jaguar and you start killing human beings. So I've never been allowed to collect it. They refuse to show it to me. It's too dangerous. Next one. Now, up to this point, all of these concepts fit in with what Viveros de Castro describes as multinatural perspectivism, this idea that human beings and animals can transform into one another, that the outwards, that the body, that the underlying human soul can take various forms, that the body can transform into these multiple forms depending on one's perspective. So when the illness spirit sees the young child painted as jaguar, they see a jaguar. The physical form, the biological form can change across these multiple beings. Next slide. But with the concept of jaguar transformation, I encountered sort of a problem that I didn't quite understand. I learned this one day, it hit me one day. I was arriving in the village late in the afternoon. I stopped by to see Margarita, an old friend. She lived a couple hours down from the village. She was getting very old. She was senile. She couldn't see very well. She needed a granddaughter to take her to the bathroom. And she was clearly getting very old. And when I arrived in the village a few hours later, almost towards the end of the day, I told my brother Ismael, yeah, I stopped by Margarita. She's looking to be very old. She's very weak. Yeah, he says, yeah, she's getting pretty old. It's pretty sad. Anyway, stop by later on when you get set up and drink some masato, some manioc beer. So I got my tent set up and everything like that. And a couple hours later, it took quite a while. I walked about an hour through the forest with a flashlight and got to Ismael's house about 8 p.m. And the first thing he does, he looks at me and says, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, you told me to come drink masato." He says, "Yeah, but what did you tell me about Margarita?" I said, "Well, she's old. She's great." And he says, and I was, and? Duh, the jaguar on the path. It's like, what? There's a jaguar on the path. And he says, "What are you, dumb or something?" And so finally I sort of pieced it together. All of the symptoms, all the signs that I told about Margarita, her getting old, incontinent, senile, these are symptoms for the Machinginga of turning into a jaguar. And so the verb for this in Machinginga is maitagansi, to grow fur. So as an old person becomes elderly, senile, loses control, they can't eat very much, they say that they are turning into a jaguar. They say they no longer eat very much in the day because they're out at night hunting. And always, whenever there's an old person who gets into the state, there's always a jaguar that appears in the village. And they say, that's who it is. It's that person starting to turn into a jaguar. When people die when elderly people die after a long illness, the family puts resin in their nose from the symphonia plant. It's a kind of, they call it breo. It's a kind of black resin that's used to fletch arrows. And the idea is that because jaguars breathe through their nostrils, when the person dies and wakes up as a jaguar, the jaguar can no longer breathe and dies. And so in the past, the Machinginga, when they would get old, they wouldn't allow themselves to get to the state of senility. They would simply walk off in the forest and vanish. And they would say, sometimes you'd never find their bones. They would just go straight up to the sky and become spirits. But nowadays with Western healthcare and missionary, obviously the elderly people don't commit self-euthanasia anymore, going to the forest, or self-transformation. They become old and senile and die. And there's this idea now that there's an epidemic of old people and of jaguars. And what struck me as a contradiction is, how is it that the Machinginga see these old, infirm, beloved elders as this most dangerous predator? And it didn't seem to fit with the standard sort of model of perspectivism. Next slide. And then the case of Cornelio, I'm not going to have time to tell it in full, but Emma Maris wrote a wonderful article for National Geographic when I visited Cornelio with her in 2015. And he was this wonderful old man, a good friend of mine for years, and he was going through the same process, turning into a jaguar. He was having bad dreams. His wife was afraid to sleep next to him at night. He was grunting, making strange sounds at night. And he told me, when I was young, someone gave me kawiniri to become a good hunter. I became a great hunter, but now no one warned me of the side effects. Now I'm turning into a jaguar and I'm scared to death I'm going to kill my wife or kill my family, kill my grandchildren. And he made these dozens and dozens of protective amulets to protect himself. But in the end, he got shamanic treatment. He got better for a while, but in the end, he died. And everyone said he became a jaguar. Next slide. And so this confused me. Why is it that old people turn into jaguars? It made no sense to me. This photo right here, right about the time that Cornelio died, a single jaguar killed 9 dogs and attacked 2 people and killed 1 child in a neighboring village. And everyone said that was Cornelio. So this is no joking matter. They really take this stuff seriously. One time I was in a garden and there was this burnt spot with jaguar bones. And I said, what's going on here? And said, well, this was so-and-so. And I figured out it was a person who died and turned into a jaguar, and they killed it and burned it so it wouldn't come back to life. But when I looked at the skull, it was this huge, huge skull, and all the teeth were rotten out. And suddenly it hit me. No one told me this. I sort of had to figure it out. Old jaguars old people turn into old jaguars because old and sick jaguars lose teeth, they become ill, and they come near the villages to hunt chickens, easy prey. The Machiginga say normal jaguars live off in the forest, and they don't attack people. Only these were-jaguars that are old people come and hunt chickens. And so I think that there's a metaphorical association between the old person who can't eat anymore and then the old jaguar has to come and live in the village. And this is all part of an emotional distancing that goes on with the Machiginga. As people get older and approach death, there's a whole mourning ritual that involves you sort of distance yourself from the dying person so that you don't feel emotionally attached when they finally go on. Next slide. Eduardo Cohn is an old friend of mine. I actually met him when he was a junior in high school, in Princeton High School, many years ago. And he's written very eloquently about these human-animal relationships. And so next slide, please. I sent him an early draft of this paper, and I've talked about this, and I told him about, next slide, past the next 2 or 3, about this connection between mythology, art, the social connections, old age, dying, and you stop there, and natural history. And I said, and I told this all to Eduardo, and he says, yeah, but it sounds very reductive. It's like you're saying, the old people, old jaguar, seems very reductive. I said, yes, but Eduardo, it's the jaguar who takes the first step. None of this happens. There's all of this background, cosmology background, these beliefs, but it's only when the jaguar sets foot in the village that this belief becomes activated and the person realizes that they're turning into a jaguar. And this is the final slide. Returning to this idea of kobengari, I was initially intrigued by why is it that the Machiginga think that their elders turn into jaguars? And you could turn that on its head and say, isn't it interesting that the Machiginga look at the jaguars as elders in a certain sense? Subconsciously, I'm not saying they do this consciously, but the fact that that this idea of kobengari is respect born of fear, but in looking upon jaguars metaphorically as old people through this inversion of the old people and jaguars, you can see how maybe the Machiginga hunters, these young men who are hunters out there hunting peccaries and so on, maybe in a sense, they also respect the jaguars out of a sense of pity because they realize that someday they too are going to become old, won't be able to take care of themselves, and will become a burden on their family. So I just like to close on this thought of how this belief, the elders turn into jaguars, but the jaguars also in a certain sense become old and become like elders and require care.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Glenn. These 5 presentations illustrate a variety of approaches and perspectives for understanding and improving the relationships between people and jaguars. There are clearly great opportunities to expand and improve conservation strategies, incorporating perspectives of anthropologists and traditional knowledge, but has all this potential for interdisciplinary research and transdisciplinary collaboration been fully realized? And this is something I would like to invite the entire panel to share your expertise, your personal experiences on these questions. Before we kick off the discussion, I would like to remind the audience to select the language to English. It can be done by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So the discussion will probably start now and continue in our session tomorrow. So just keep in mind that we have another session on this panel tomorrow. So again, are there any barriers preventing this move towards interdisciplinary research, transdisciplinary collaboration? If so, then what barriers have you faced yourself, these barriers? It's over to you, panel, please. Who would like to start?
Well, I very much appreciated, Sylvia, your perspective, giving these axes from conservation to community engagement and the different sort of these different axes of different people from different disciplines. And I was really intrigued in the first two presentations about this, and in Felipe's, of course, this ambiguity of how the jaguars are, in a sense, they're feared and admired. And I think that linked into what I was trying to talk about. And especially the idea of how, you know, in the first two presentations, a lot of these people didn't even know that it was illegal to hunt jaguars. And I think this is a representation of how these rural communities are abandoned by the elites and by the government agencies. And so this work it's not only about conserving jaguars and raising awareness about jaguars, but I think it's also about bringing knowledge about the government services that are available and the laws. I mean, we're sort of in areas where the law scarcely applies, and when it applies, it's usually applied in a negative sense and not in a positive sense. And so I think the work of all panelists before mine had a sense of community engagement. How do we understand what these people are? What is their relationship to jaguars? Why are they killing them? What do they have a positive feeling about them? And how is it that these populations who are so often overlooked by government agencies, by conservation workers, how can they become part of that dialogue? And I think your presentation of these different axes was a very useful way of organizing that question.
Any comment on
Yes,
that? Melissa, please.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with Glenn. And I also think, at least in my perspective and in the places that I conducted my research, it was clear that even though some indigenous communities had received a lot of research attention and their relationships with jaguars were a bit more understood in terms of their myths and traditions and cultural aspects, it was interesting to me to see that rural communities that are mixed ethnicity, not necessarily indigenous, and that often, as Cristina was saying, maybe they just recently arrived to some areas from distant locations or from very different urban areas, and they are settling into new spaces. They are immediately set with this environment, with new animals, with predators. And even though they develop these complex relationships with the animals, perhaps they haven't necessarily received as much research attention, like they're not normally subjects of anthropological research or attention in general. And so I think we're missing a lot of opportunity of understanding these communities, how they react to the animals around them, how they develop their own stories to explain why the animals are acting in such a way. And so I think perhaps my recommendation would be to expand our academic curiosity to these communities, which in fact are the largest group of people that interact with jaguars throughout their range. It's not just the indigenous communities in protected areas, but just everyone who lives in the jaguar range and coexists with these animals. And I agree as well with the fact that there is a lack of understanding about the law and even of just the presence of the state in many of these areas. So coming in to bring that awareness is crucial, but not necessarily starting with the enforcement, which is often how we react to these wildlife trafficking, but rather with the education, the knowledge, the understanding, and particularly the empathy of understanding what they're going through, how difficult it is. So I think that is perhaps a change in perspective that could really help to make people change their habits and behaviors around the animals.
Silvio, if may I
Melissa.
intervene now?
Quisiera opinar algo.
María Fernanda.
Hola, voy a hablar en español, pero me ayudan a traducir. Ok. Bueno, una de las cosas que yo he visto, mi experiencia es que algo que considero importante y creo que nos ha faltado, no sé si logran escucharme bien o la traducción va bien, ok. Una de las cosas que yo considero importante es el entendimiento de la ecología del jaguar, no desde el nivel científico, sino más bien llevarlo a un nivel inclusive mucho más pequeño, y me refiero al tema de incorporar el conocimiento de la ecología del jaguar en escala de educación básica, de primaria, de niños, ¿sí? Porque yo lo que veo es que mucho de la problemática que ocurre con este felino es justamente por desconocimiento de la biología. Muchas veces no se sabe por qué depreda, o muchas veces el miedo se va asociado al desconocimiento del tiempo de vida de un jaguar, cuál es la dieta del jaguar, cómo es el comportamiento. Hemos tenido casos en los que nos hablan, por ejemplo, de que aquí hay una manada de jaguares que nos está atacando el ganado, cuando se sabe que el jaguar es un animal que no siempre ataca en grupos, sino que cuando es una hembra con sus cachorros. Entonces, digamos que el conocimiento realmente sobre la ecología de la especie es fundamental para inclusive mitigar ese problema desde abajo, ¿no? Desde mitigar todo ese problema, conociendo lo básico de la especie, quizás incorporándose en programas educativos a nivel nacional de los países donde está esta especie. Creo que podría ayudar a mejorar un poquito la visión, porque mucho se hace por desconocimiento. Muchas veces lo hacemos nosotros los biólogos o las personas que trabajamos con el jaguar directamente en una comunidad que trabajamos, pero no con todas las comunidades. O sea, no llega a todo el mundo. Y por ejemplo, como me pasaba con la comunidad indígena Piaroa, que juraban que el jaguar vivía más de 60 años y podía recordar al abuelo o al tío que intentó cazar al animal por desconocimiento. Y cuando les explicábamos, por ejemplo, que un jaguar, el promedio de vida es de 15 años aproximadamente, y que los casos más extremos eran 17, 18 años en vida silvestre, ellos mismos se sorprendían y nos preguntaban, o sea que el jaguar que intentó cazar a mi abuelo no me recuerda o no recuerda a mi abuelo, porque eso siempre lo hemos temido, inclusive hemos dejado de visitar ciertas cuevas por ese temor. Entonces, digamos que el tema de la biología o la ecología de la especie es fundamental empezar a enseñarla desde todos los niveles, no solamente en las comunidades directamente en las que trabajamos, sino que en todos los aspectos, en niños, en adolescentes y en las comunidades, o sea, en los pescadores, en los mismos cazadores. Por ejemplo, mi experiencia también era que muchos de los cazadores que habían matado al jaguar lo habían hecho porque tenían temor porque tenían a su esposa embarazada, y hay una historia relacionada con las mujeres embarazadas y la atracción del jaguar a las mujeres embarazadas, y resulta que cuando les demostraba que inclusive tenías registros fotográficos o de videos de animales que habían pasado cerca de sitios donde había mujeres embarazadas y nunca había ocurrido ningún ataque, entonces digamos que ese tipo de cosas se iban como cayendo, ¿no? Esas eran como mentiras o historias que iban como cayendo, se iban perdiendo, y entonces digamos que tratar de demostrar un poco cuál es la dinámica de la especie en otras escalas También considero que es importante y por eso hemos tratado de trabajar mucho con educadores de colegios, como para que ellos de cierta manera hagan actividades a los niños y vayan incorporando esa información y que se vaya aclarando ese panorama sobre la especie para, digamos, disminuir ese problema. Gracias.
Maria Fernanda. Cristina?
Yes, Silvio. Just to answer your question, I think that it is a very complex question. I think that there are still many barriers because the problem is, as I said, complex and diverse, as we have seen through all the presentations. Although we share many common aspects, the conflict between humans and jaguars is manifested differently in different areas. So this is still a challenging issue, but I would like to highlight like the good part of it, and that is that until today, jaguars are, you know, like a good icon for conservation, and this is so that it have been used for many conservation campaigns. There are many people interested in the jaguars. We have 30 people in this panel, and we're expecting more later. You know, jaguars are good vectors for conversation, for discussions, for making campaigns, and maybe they can speak different languages. They represent something for us as scientists. They represent something for rural communities. And a very funny aspect in Calakmul, for example, is that despite all the conflict that exists with jaguars and the people want to kill them because of of many reasons, compared to other felids, they're most respected. This doesn't avoid the killing, but when you talk to people, they say, oh, the pumas are the bad ones. We don't like the pumas, we don't tolerate them because they attack, they're bad. Well, the jaguars, well, yeah, they kill, but they just kill the cows. They're like the good guys. You know, maybe I'm using like very blunt words, but this is like the idea behind. So jaguars represent this hope, you know, of union and understanding between different sectors and within all of us. So I just want to leave that thought.
Silvio, just to make a comment, I think it's great to hear about the project here, because we see your question is putting into practice, you know, how to manage these possibilities of dialogue between different fields and different kinds of knowledge. We have these challenges, the relationship between academic knowledge and indigenous or local knowledge at one side, and the relation between different academic fields, nature and culture, humanities and natural sciences. I think that's are the barriers that we have to deal. And one possibility, we see some possibilities, we saw here some possibilities of dialogue, and I think a crucial step is like to look for research programs that are multidisciplinary, that can like put the different aspects together, and it is beginning to be a reality, I think.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Christina. There's a discussion in the chat about the lessons learned from jaguars applied to the reintroduction of large carnivores in Europe. There was a question for Christina, and I hope Christina can answer to that question in the chat directly to John Burton. And I am afraid it's time to wrap up, Lucia and Eliana. Well, the jaguar is the most iconic species in Latin America. The values assigned to the jaguar are strong, diverse, and oftentimes polarized. And a significant proportion of the remaining area of the distribution of jaguars coincide with indigenous territories. Therefore, anthropology can arguably make a greater contribution to the conservation of jaguars than to the conservation of any other species in Latin America. Jaguar conservationists must be open to these alternative approaches beyond the traditional frameworks of conservation science and management. And what we've heard here today illustrates the importance of integrating disciplines, going beyond disciplinary boundaries to integrate anthropology into conservation science, and the importance of collaboration that goes beyond, that involves academia and local communities, transdisciplinary collaboration, understanding and managing human-wildlife interaction, especially in situations where unscientific thinking prevails. Conservation in general and jaguar conservation in particular is moving in this direction. And we hope that this panel can make a small contribution to this, for this to happen. We have to close now. This fascinating discussion continues. We have our second session tomorrow, led by Anthony Cummins from the University of Texas at Dallas, where we will be talking about interactions between humans and jaguars in places relatively underrepresented in the literature, such as Guyana and Suriname, as well as talking about film research methodology. You don't want to miss it, do you? So thank you and see you tomorrow, and might the power be with the jaguar.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Silvio.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. That was awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
We should have created a Google Meet, one of those meeting places that they have in the Congress. That
We still
could
can
bring
do it.
together
We
for
can do
tomorrow.
it.
For tomorrow,
Yeah.
each one grabs a tea or a drink, and then we can talk.
This was really amazing and awesome, really. Silvio, you did an excellent job. Congratulations. It was very,
It was nice.
well, very insightful. You guided the whole conversation. Perfect. Very, very, very well. So thank you so much, Silvio. I wanted to have the word back to thank you, but you took all the full.
I wish we had more time for discussion. I'm sorry for that.
No, don't be sorry. I mean,
It's good we have a second chance tomorrow. So I hope this will be just a warming up for a good discussion tomorrow with more speakers tomorrow,
guys.
hopefully.
Yes, and you said we had 40 people, but we have more because there isn't the WOHAs. They are not visible here, and I counted like 17 total. So there was a huge audience. But you don't see them in Zoom as participants. They use this platform. So it was very well attended.
Right. Yeah, and hopefully tomorrow we have even more people, because
Liliana, I have a
the
suggestion.
word will spread, and oh wow, let's see this tomorrow,
Guys.
led by Anthony Cummins. And
Do you hear me talking or not?
Yes, Barbara, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. There is a way that we could create a meeting room in the Congress. I was today navigating and trying to learn this platform, and they have this possibility that you create a topic. So we could create a topic like Jaguar or the power of the Jaguar, and there people can gather, and as I understood, it stays there. It's like a place, virtual place, but it's during the whole time it's there. So
I'll try to make one, and we have people with us. Miguel, hi, we're talking about. Good to have you still with us, Miguel, and I see more people. Lisa, Vanessa is also with us. Yeah, so I'll make that group so that we continue and we see what we can do together, because I guess many people also, following the questions, many people were very interested in the papers also. Yeah, so good stuff for tomorrow.
Well, also from my side, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Silvio, and thank you to the presenters, and also thanks to the RAI staff, specifically to Rohi for all the support. And yeah, I think we have a plan for tomorrow with the next session.
you guys.
Thank you all.
Have a good day, evening.
Bye, thank you. And thank you, Lucia, for all the emails and the organization and all the logistics behind.
Gracias a
Yes,
todos y
thank you so
todas.
much.
Gracias,
Chao,
Fernanda, por
María
traer el
Fernanda. Chao,
español
Cristina.
al seminario.
Ciao,
Chao,
ciao.
Melissa.
Gracias, Silvio. Gracias, Liliana. Bye.
Bye bye.
And thank
Chao,
you,
Liliana.
Monica,
Chao,
for the
Lucia.
amazing interpretation.
Oh, Monica, yeah, she's really brilliant.
See y'all tomorrow.
Thanks a lot.
Great
See
job,
you, Anthony.
Silvia.
If you have any questions, right here. Hi, Monica. Un gusto.
Hi, Monica.
Thank you, Mónica. Gracias.
Bye-bye, everyone.